Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Green Party will be strongly supporting this bill. It does, if passed, and I hope it does, correct a major injustice for workers in this country being laid off without any redundancy. I think the problem is not the problem. In fact, I think David Bennett conceded a bit where he said the problem with this bill is that employers will stick to the minimum rather than giving more redundancy. The problem we have is not that the employers stick to some legislative minimum that doesn't exist. The problem is that they don't give any redundancy at all in many cases, and we've got a recent statement from the National Distribution Union referring to a dozen workers that were laid off by T.A. McAllister Company without any redundancy at all because of a downturn in business. And a warehouse supervisor, Rob Heisted, who was laid off, says, "I feel bitter. The warehouse in this company has been my baby. I was proud at how well I made it work. Then they just said, piss off. It's 20 years of my life down the toilet." And Mr Heisted said that another couple with 40 years service between them had also been shown the door without so much as a thank you from the company. That is the problem we face, and that is why it's important to have this minimum of 4 weeks notice, 4 weeks redundancy after 1 year, 2 weeks additional up to 22 weeks. And this is consistent both with long-standing Green Party policy, but also the report has been pointed out of the Public Advisory Committee on Restructuring and Redundancy. Now, why do we have redundancy? One point is it's a recognition by the employer who has benefited from the labour of workers often over many, many years, as in the case I mentioned. It's a recognition of the value of that work. Here, have something now, unfortunately, we have to make you redundant. Secondly, it's to reduce the suffering that workers face when they're laid off, and the unemployment benefit is not in itself sufficient, and there's a little qualifying period there as well. And particularly now when we have couples working and people are mortgaged up to the hilt. One of the couple loses a job, they can't afford to pay the mortgage, the house goes down the drain, all kinds of things happen. There's huge suffering if you haven't got that continuity of income while you're looking for another job. And I think that the third point is that breathing space to find another job, not just find another job, but find a job in your specialist area if at all possible, to have the time to look around to get an appropriate job. And often the problem is that workers are very highly specialised and geared to one job, and take a while either to get trained to something else, to look around for something equivalent. I was made redundant myself when I was working at the Gear Meatworks in 1981 when it closed down. We did get some redundancy pay, but I know that it was very difficult for many of the workers there who were highly specialised, knife hands, who had spent decades as knife hands, and many of them got very depressed, and their families got depressed because they didn't have other work in their specialist area, which I think relates to another thing that's in the Public Advisory Group's report, and that is to give plenty of notice, like in this bill there's 4 weeks notice of redundancy required, but also to look a bit further out. If something's happening to the industry, if some changes going on, there might be redundancies, to have a whole transition to a new employment, and that is why it's important to have adult education and not cut night classes, which are often a way of transition to a new job, and unfortunately this government has cut night classes. We want to be able to ratify ILO Convention 158, and it's important that we do measures like this so that we can. We don't want to be in breach of international conventions. And the question is not that somehow workers are going to suffer, as David Bennett points out. In fact, I think having redundancy provisions is a deterrent for employers against laying people off. It just adds that little bit of restraint, which is good. And the idea that somehow it stops employers employing people is a bit silly too. How many employers really think that, well, in 3 years I might have to lay off this employer and pay them 8 weeks redundancy, therefore I'm not going to employ them? That isn't part of the way things are going. And
I regret to advise the member that his time has expired. I call Honey Harawira.